Well, hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today we have Kevin Springman from the Department of Education, Bureau of Career and Technical Education, speaking on understanding secondary concentrators and the definition that is out of the Guide to Student Occupational Competency Testing. After the webinar is over, we are recording this webinar, so I will send the recorded link out to everybody, along with a link to that guidebook for reference. Everybody is muted currently and will remain muted throughout the webinar, but we are going to take questions if you have any at the end of the session. So if you want to type your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to go ahead and use the chat feature as well, as we will be monitoring both sections on our end. So with that, I would like to welcome Kevin. Kevin, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful.
I want to make sure that I'm loud enough here for everybody to hear. Yeah, I want to apologize that normally this section of information is given at the test site coordinators meeting in the fall, but as everybody knows, we had the Perkins 5 state plan being developed, and so the changes in the definitions that impact testing had to be delayed a little bit before going public with everything to make sure that all the stakeholders were involved in the review of the definitions and that things were pretty much solidified by before we started to have everybody use the definitions for the testing program. So we've gone through the stakeholder meetings. The state plan has been drafted and sent to the governor, and it just has to be acted on by the state board next month. But as everyone here knows, we have to order tests for the students, and Perkins 4 had a concentrator definition, the 50% concentrator definition that everybody was familiar with, and Perkins 5, that concentrator definition has changed. So for the students being tested at the end of the year, you want to apply the Perkins 5 concentrator definition rather than the 50% of program completed definition. So I wanted to do this webinar so everybody has the latest information. We've had a couple of questions come up after the testing guide was distributed. So I thought I would try to go over the definition and some of the questions and see if there are new questions that have come up and mention a couple other issues having to do with testing and go from there. So the main change under Perkins 5, as I mentioned, is the secondary concentrator definition. And you can find the new definition on page 2 of your testing guide, occupational testing guide. We have it up there on the screen. I'm just going to read it so we reinforce a couple of different modalities. Secondary concentrator is a student who completes at least 2 state-defined CTE courses. Pennsylvania defines a CTE course as a minimum of 240 technical instructional hours as planned per year in a PDE-approved CTE program. Completing at least 480 technical instructional hours is required for PDE-approved one-year CTE programs. Note, completing means pass the course and earn credit. So there are a couple of different pieces to this definition. We've had a couple of questions come up. Basically, you want to think in terms of your program as it's improved in CATS. If some of you haven't been in the CATS system, you might want to talk to somebody at the school who works with CATS and look at the scope and sequence page in CATS. Each program has an approved scope and sequence, which is the approved plan for the program. IEP students, of course, have an individualized program. It can differ from the approved scope and sequence, but the scope and sequence is what we're looking at when we think of this definition as far as being planned in the approved CTE program. So the definition for most programs, the multi-year programs, we're looking at 2 courses being the minimum to be a concentrator. The minimum number of technical hours passed is 240. So if a student passes 240 technical hours in a year or more, they would be considered to have 1 course in that year. So to be considered a concentrator, they would need to complete 2 years in a multi-year program. For a 1-year approval, we have a couple of schools with 1-year approvals. The technical hours would be 480 or more in a year to be considered a secondary concentrator. This differs depending on the program, varies a little bit as far as being different from the 50% standard. We've had a couple of people contact us with 2-year programs, 2-year program in the past, but you had to complete half of the program, 50%. Now you need to have 2 years worth of courses completed, which would be both years of a 2-year approval with 240 hours or more. Those hours are not cumulative in the sense of people use the cumulative hours in the past to calculate the percentage of program completed. If you complete 360 hours in a year, you don't add the extra over the 240. You basically passed a course that's 240 hours or more for that year, and the student then must pass a second course of 240 hours or more if they have a multi-year approval in the CAT system.
Kevin, this is Lori. Real quick, are you able to speak up a little bit? We have some people that aren't able to hear quite well.
Surely, I'll try to speak louder.
Thank you. Perfect. That sounds better.
I'll go back over that briefly. The new completer standard, students that are in a multi-year program approval need to complete 2 courses, each with 140 or more hours in a year of the technical component. With 1-year approvals, the students need to successfully complete 480 hours or more to be considered a concentrator for testing. Okay, well, if some come up, I'll address them. Or there were just a couple other issues I also wanted to go over because they had come up in conjunction with some of the questions about the concentrator. The first one is the perennial issue of the completer definition. The completer definition stays the same. It's located in the Appendix P of Volume 2 of the PIMS manual for secondary schools. The definition of completer is a student who's completed all secondary level competencies necessary to achieve his or her career objective or met appropriate related IEP objectives. 2, completed a PDE approved occupational end of program assessment or completed a program which has an assessment waiver. And 3, attained a high school diploma or equivalent. So I know there tends to be a lot of confusion between completers and concentrators. This completer definition you can find in the PIMS manual, as I mentioned, Volume 2, Appendix P. It's an end of year status code. It stays the same. The testing component of that is to take the complete test. It doesn't require the student to pass the test to be a completer. They just must take the complete test. And that involves for the NOCTI taking both written and performance components. And for the NIMS test, it involves taking 3 tests because you have to take 3 tests um, to be eligible to be competent. So I want to encourage any uh, test site coordinators that work with NIMS instructors that they look at the pattern of test taking and make sure the students are taking 3 tests, because without the 3 tests, they're not eligible for a certificate. They're not taking the complete test, so they can't be counted as completers. They do get industry certification credit for taking one NIMS test, but they aren't eligible for the completer definition or the certifications associated with the testing. So we want to make sure with the NIMS locations that they're all providing enough testing opportunities that the students can take 3 tests and be considered eligible. The secondary competencies associated with the career objective, that has stayed the same. I usually point out the IEP clause because ideally we want the IEP students and team to be looking at the competencies that are associated with their career objective, whether it's a limited objective or whether it's a full program objective. The IEP team should ideally be tracking those competencies and making sure the student is following towards the goal of the transition plan for after graduation. We've had a couple of questions come up with regard to students taking an extra year under an IEP, and we do encourage that to get extra competencies to be more likely to pass the NOCTI and receive their certificates. But we want to make sure the IEP teams are following the competencies and following the career objectives of the student. And ideally, the student should have a career assessment that helps guide them in their plan moving forward. So the other question that's come up with IEP teams is we really want the IEP teams to know the value of the testing. We've had some people be a little hesitant with regard to testing if they thought a student might struggle with the testing, but in many cases, parents are looking towards some of the post-secondary credit that is aligned to the testing program as far as program of study articulated credits and some of the post-secondary credits offered by NOCTI for testing. So we want to make sure that the IEP teams are aware of the benefits of testing before they or when they're evaluating the testing. There is an exemption for the PASA students, but we have had IEP teams that have recommended testing even to a student that fell under the PASA categorization, and we do allow that. And if that's a situation, it's good to let Lori know, and we try to make sure that the IEP team's recommendations are followed, and we accommodate that testing situation. Yeah, there's one last thing, a question that's come up that I think has been brought up with regard to testing and the Future Ready PA Index with test site coordinators, and it may have caught people a little off guard. I've had a couple of directors call me and say, why isn't our Future PA Index score on NOCTI as high as the NOCTI report? And after some investigation and research with the people that do the Future Ready PA Index, they basically explained to me that the Future Ready PA Index uses all seniors as a denominator. So if a student doesn't test, they're included in the denominator and calculated into that percentage. So if you have questions that come up with that regard, you can find you may have a lower percentage on the Future Ready PA Index site because some of the students that didn't test are being included in the denominator. It's not an error in the NOCTI reporting. But if that comes up, feel free to give me a call, send me an email, and I can check with the people who do those calculations and make sure that it's accurately reflecting the NOCTI scores.
I think that concludes us for today. Did you have anything to add before closing?
No, just that, feel free to send me an email with questions or call my number. I realize this is a big transition here on many levels, and we're available for questions at any point. So I think that's it. I appreciate everybody's participation and appreciate the questions. And hopefully I clarified some issues for people.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Very informative session. Just a reminder to everybody, we will be sending you a link to this recorded webinar so that you can review it again and share it if you'd like, along with some links to the guidebook and some of the other documents that we talked about throughout the webinar. So thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.